And of course, the third one is we want to make superannuation voluntary. Superannuation is one of these key decisions that economic decisions made decades ago that has contributed to the demise of our economy in a way that I don't think many people realise, and I'll explain why. Today, we have 40% of people that retire today retire with a mortgage. That's up from 10% in 1992. Now, that's not necessarily the false superannuation, in isolation. But what it does demonstrate is, and what happens is when these people retire who do have a mortgage, they suck their money out of superannuation and they pay off their debt and they go on the pension anyway. And that's borne out by the figures that show that there's more people on the pension today as a percentage of population, more retirees on the pension than what there were in 1992. So in 1992, there were 50% of people on a full pension and about 25% of retirees on a part pension. Today, the median balance for women aged 60 to 64, the median superannuation balance they hold, so median is 50% of the population in that age cohort, is only $158,000. So that is not even anywhere near the $312,000 you need to have in assets to go off a full pension. And the reason why that matters is that $158,000 every month gets fees clicked on it, right? So you're paying fees, a percentage of fees on this money that you have no control over. And if we actually apply that, so the Productivity Commission estimated back in 2019 that the cost of superannuation was about 1% of funds under management, and that's about right. You can see that on the superannuation statements. So back then they estimated it cost $30 billion, but if you put that same assumption of $4 trillion under funds under management today, it's worth about $40 billion, which is what we spend on the military. And I can assure you we don't need any more financial engineers in this country. What we really need are more civil engineers, mechanical engineers and electrical engineers. But here's the other thing with superannuation where it's a false economy. If you basically, the median income in this country is $80,000. So what that means is there's 14 million workers. It means the middle of those 14 million workers at the 7 million percent, 7 or 50% decile or around the 7 million people mark, 7 million people earn $80,000 or less. So if you earn $80,000 today, you'll pay just under $20,000 in tax, and you'll need about $50,000 to live on, right? That means you've got about $10,000 left you can save. What happens to that money? It goes off to superannuation, doesn't it? Because 12% of $80,000 is $9,600. So nearly, it might be 12% of your total income, but it's nearly 6% of your disposable income. Goes off to some bloke you've never met, and there's no guarantee you're going to get it back when you're 67. I don't know, is there anyone here that was impacted by the First Guardian debacle? So I don't know if you heard about that, but 12,000 people lost about $1 billion in funds under management I think it was a few months ago now, and these guys have lost their money. So I caught up with a lady a couple of weeks ago before I came down here. She'd lost $80,000. She's not a wealthy woman at all. She had $80,000 in super that she'd saved over the years. She has a small mortgage of $200,000 on a house, like she's not super wealthy. And as she said, she would have been better if she could have had that $80,000 and paid it off against the mortgage. It would have almost halved the mortgage and halved her interest bill and her monthly repayments, right? She's lost that money. And that's what I hate about superannuation. It's a bit like a vaccine mandate. You have no say whether or not you get to keep your 12% of your wages, but there's no guarantee if it all goes wrong, right? A bit like if you're vaccine injured. So that's something that's really annoying. But here's the thing. You might say, yeah, Gerard, but people can't save for their own retirement. This is something I often get on my Facebook, my social media. No, Gerard, we've got to have compulsory superannuation because people can't save their own retirement. That's an absolute insult to most people because most people can save. And we know that because before superannuation was introduced, which country had the highest percentage of home ownership in the world? Australia. And of course, what better way to save for your retirement than own your own house, correct? So this is the false economy of superannuation. Yes, you may be earning, as they like to say, you're earning 7% on your superannuation, but here's the thing. if I'm someone, and most young people, they'll be lucky to earn more than $80,000 in their first job. You've got to work your way up. That $10,000, if they could save that, so you give them 5 years to save $10,000, they might have $50,000. That could be a deposit to say, well, at least it shouldn't be because 5% is not enough. But if you could use that to say buy a house for $1 million, I'll just use $1 million because it's a simple number. That means that you're in the market, because if that money in super is delaying the time you can buy a house, the opportunity cost of that money being in super is 7% of the cost of the house. So if house prices are rising by 7%, which on $1 million is $70,000 a year, you might be getting 7% on your $50,000 in super, $3,500, but your opportunity cost is the $66,500 that the house is going up by, right? And that is what matters. You want something physical and a roof over your head. So that is the false dichotomy or the false economy of superannuation. It's not actually, really getting people into houses like it should be. And of course, the other thing is eventually, and of course, they'll never tell you this, is that it is a massive Ponzi scheme. And the reason for that is when the first generation of people who have put money into super for their entire lifetime start to retire, they will be withdrawing 40 years worth of contributions, or potentially, they don't have to, but if they don't do it when they retire, some of those people with the 40%, the 40% of people with a mortgage, a lot of them will be taking it out when they retire. Other people will be taking it out when they pass away, and they pass it on to their children, who won't be putting it into a super fund because they won't be allowed to. They'll be using it to pay off the house or whatever. But the point is, let's just assume they take it out when they retire. You're taking out 40 years worth of contributions. You're going to need 40 people coming in making 1 year's worth of contributions to match the withdrawal of that money. Does that make sense? So there's going to be a tipping point around 2040 when people around my generation start to retire. So I was born in 1970. Superannuation was introduced on the 1st of July 1992, albeit at 2%. So at the end of my working career, it might be 60, 65, something like that. If I wanted to, like people born around 1970, they're going to start withdrawing big lump sums of superannuation. If they don't do it when they retire, they'll do it when they pass away. So you're going to have massive withdrawals coming out of superannuation, and that's going to create a real problem in superannuation funds. So and now that's probably been happening a little bit, because superannuation now has been around for 33 years, isn't it? Yeah, well, they've been getting away with it for a while because they only started at 2%, and they've been increasing contributions to 12%. But of course, this is another reason why they want increasing immigration, because they need a bigger workforce to basically come in and pay the 12% to meet the withdrawals. But just as a matter of interest, can anyone tell me what was the result of the referendum in 1992 when Paul Keating went to the public and said, by 2025, I'm going to take 12% of your money and I'm going to give it to someone you've never met. There's no guarantee you're ever going to get it back. Does anyone know the result of that referendum? What's that? Don't remember it? No, you're right. There wasn't one, was there? Because if they had a referendum, you think they would have voted for it? Of course not. In 1997, New Zealand had a referendum. Do you know what the result of that referendum was? It was the same. It was the referendum. It was like, do you support compulsory superannuation? Do you know what the result of that referendum was? Yeah, they were against it, 92% to 8%. Because there's no way they wanted the government taking, anyone taking their money. But of course they stuck it in here at 2% and then slowly increased it over the years. But of course, the other thing with superannuation is there's basically $4 trillion in super today. $3 trillion of that's controlled by, $1 trillion of it is controlled by people who use self-managed super funds. But for the other $3 trillion of it, about 2/3 of it's controlled by the industry funds, which are controlled by the unions. They actually use one proxy advisor at AGMs to vote collectively on decisions made by big ASX 200 companies. And they now are controlled. And then the other 10% or the other third is in private super funds. And they generally use BlackRock and Vanguard to vote in AGMs as well. So basically, the problem with when you've got $3 trillion in capital, what does that mean? If you control $3 trillion in capital, what does that mean? It means you control the economy, doesn't it? And basically, we've seen today our economy is being driven by ideology, not productivity. And as a result, our private sector is actually the number of new listings on the ASX. The number of actually not new listings, sorry, the number of listed shares on the ASX is actually declining. Right, that's how bad our productivity is in this country. It's not just the number of new listings is decreasing. There's actually more companies delisting than there are listing, and that's a real concern. And that's a result of the way our market and our economy is structured, where entrepreneurship is being stifled. Because yet again, someone young who's an entrepreneur, who might actually use that 12% of his income to fund some sort of a startup, can't actually do that because it's inside his super or her super. So that's a real problem as well. But just in regards to making all that capital accountable, one of our policies, it's not a key policy, but I will mention it, is that we're going to force all superannuation boards to actually hold elections as to who their board members should be. So I don't know if how many of you out there have got your money in a non-self-managed super fund, but I doubt has anyone here been able to vote on who their board is? I think there are a couple of industry funds that or super funds that allow you to vote for their board, but most super funds, they just pick their mates to run the boards, right? And they're basically selected, not elected. So there are our three policies, and those policies are all designed to basically decentralise the power that comes with childcare centres and superannuation funds and all that. Now, the next policy the next two policies is basically we want to reform the taxation system and the monetary system to put Australia first. This is very, very important because there were decisions made 40 years ago that have led to the mess we're in today, and I'll explain them. But I want to start off with something slightly going back to the start of the colony. Does anyone know what the name of the first generation of Australian-born people call themselves? Does anyone? Sorry. So these were the people that didn't come here. They were people born from the Rum Rebellion or off the convict ships or something, things like that. Sorry? What, first fleet? Yeah, currency. Did I hear the word currency? Yeah, currency lads and currency lasses. That's right. That's right. And the reason why they called themselves that was that they named themselves after Australia's first currency, which was the holy dollar. So the story behind that is in 1788, as you know, the first fleet arrived. We're talking modern Australia here. The first fleet arrived for the first 17 years of the colony. The colony relied on foreign currency. It didn't have its own currency. It wasn't really seen as a country. It was just a prison, convict colony and prison colony. So they just used foreign currency. Now, in 1805, there was a drought, and that currency that was used was repatriated by the foreigners because they weren't hanging around. And of course, the remaining settlers or convicts basically were left to start bartering rum. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the Rum Rebellion. Well, obviously that Rum Rebellion, went the proverbials up. So Lachlan Macquarie was sent here to basically, clean up the mess from the Rum Rebellion. And he was the first governor to see Australia as a country and not a colony. So he introduced Australia's first currency, which was called what? No, not sterling. That was what the British pound was called. No one knows Australia's first currency? Colonial? Not. Anyone? Okay. Has anyone heard of the holy dollar?
No.
Yeah. Okay. It's the dump. Yeah, the dump. Okay. So basically, Lachlan Macquarie introduced what was the Spanish bloom, and he punched a hole in it, and he called it the holy dollar and the dump. That holy dollar was used to fund the Sydney Hospital, the Sydney Barracks, all those sandstone buildings you see in Macquarie Street. That was used to basically fund infrastructure. Right? Now, who uses the holy dollar as its logo today? Macquarie Bank. That's exactly right. And there's a bit of irony in that because the very people that were at the start of the privatisation of our infrastructure in the early 90s, and this is how they got their start in life by managing these assets, our assets that were built and paid for by our forefathers were privatised. there's a bit of irony that the very bank that profited from that was actually using the logo of our holy, first dollar that actually built infrastructure. Right. That's very, very important because there's a link between infrastructure and currency, and I want to talk about that. Now, that decision, now there was a Banking Royal Commission in 1937. I just want to give you a bit of history before I go into the 1980s. There was a Banking Royal Commission in 1937, and the findings of that, and this was our true Banking Royal Commission. The one in 2016 was a Royal Commission into misconduct in the financial sector. It wasn't into the operation of banks per se. It was into misconduct in the financial sector. Big distinction as a result of what happened in the 80s and 90s. But that findings of that Banking Royal Commission said the central bank should always control the volume of credit in the system. Right? That's a very, very important statement. And then it went on to say that, and the central bank should allow the private banks to distribute that credit, but keep an eye on it, keep an eye on the distribution of that credit by the private banks. That's a very, very important statement because what that meant was that it should be our central bank that controls the volume of credit that comes into Australia, not foreign banks. Right? So if I was to say to you, let's put it this way, if Anthony Albanese was to say, we're going to lift all immigration controls, we're not going to have any visas, and people can come and go into Australia as they like, there'd be a fair chance there'd be pitchforks in front of Parliament House in the morning, wouldn't there? Bulldozers. Yeah, bulldozers. Yep, that's probably better than pitchforks, yes. Hadn't thought of that one. Now, here's the thing. The same thing happened in 1985 when Paul Keating basically said, we are not going to tell banks where they can borrow money from. We are going to lift all capital controls. And that's very, very important because does anyone know what capital is? A lot of people refer to the word capital, but they don't really know what capital is. Capital is actually debt and equity, right? There you two. So all capital is if I want to start a business, I want to say go and buy a business, I can get the money for it in two ways. I can either use my own money or I can borrow it, right? So simple distinction. Yep. So in 1985, Paul Keating just said, well, we're not going to actually control the volume of credit in the system. Private banks can go out and borrow as much money as they like, and we're not going to stop them. Now, the impact of that was that in 1985, the private banks had $8 billion in debt. By 2008, they had $800 billion in foreign debt. Okay, where do you think that money was lent to? Or lent against? Houses, exactly. And that took house prices from 4 times earnings to 10 to 12 times earnings. It then basically meant that two parents had to go back to work. And that's how our childcare centres basically got a lift. You remember Eddie Groves from ABC Learning in the late 90s and early 2000s. Yet again, whenever the government starts subsidising these things, there's always people in there clipping the ticket and doing things like that. And then in 2008, GFC occurred. And in that GFC, a lot of people had borrowed money against their investments because they were told to by these cowboy financial planners, where there were very little controls around some of the financial planners at the time. They've tightened that up a lot. So much so that even myself can't give financial advice, despite the qualifications I had. So that's sort of taken it too far. But I know one guy who's a gym instructor that went and did a financial planning course in a week and was giving financial advice. And this stuff happened. But long story short, a lot of people lost money. They were going to have to sell their houses to get themselves out of debt. So Kevin Rudd allowed foreign students to buy houses. And that's why we've seen the creation of the foreign student sector, or the explosion of the foreign student sector, since 2008. So that decision to lift capital controls in the mid-80s has created, as you can see what it's done. It's brought the childcare industry into play. That now costs $16 billion a year. The foreign students remit $8 billion a year offshore. And I mean, the foreign student visa, I think, is only about, if you want to get a visa to study here, it's only a couple of $1,000s. I don't know why they don't make it 20 grand or something. Then it might start paying for itself. But then there's another third factor that really kicked in as a result of those high levels of household debt as well. Of course, if you've got $1 million mortgage or a massive mortgage, you're going to delay when you start having a family, aren't you? And that's what we've seen. We've seen the birth rate decline. I mean, the birth rate was declining, but it's declined even more And of course, this is another reason why we have such a high immigration rate, because our birth rate's only 1.5. So our replacements, we're not replacing ourselves. And this is why we, got a high immigration rate. So, if you are concerned about high immigration, we need to sort our economy to do that. But interestingly enough, too, that deregulation of financial markets, they also allowed, because they let everything go, they also allowed savings banks to engage in speculative investing behaviour. And what was the result of that? Which savings bank in particular engaged in some pretty stupid pyramid? Yep. I was going to say another one. Exactly. The Victorian Savings Bank, or the Savings Bank of Victoria, because they were allowed to buy Tricontinental, an investment bank in the late 80s. Prior to 1985, savings banks were only allowed to basically take on take return on deposits, and they'd lend those deposits out on houses, and that was it. But when they lifted capital controls, savings banks started engaging in speculative behaviour, and of course we saw the collapse of both Pyramid and the Savings Bank of Victoria. Ironically enough, that was bought out by the Commonwealth Bank, which then went on to privatise not that much later. But that impact, I mean, I'm sure I don't need to tell some of you guys who would live through that, but that really kicked Victoria's economy in the guts at the time. So that's really, really important. And the other thing, of course, was too, when I worked at the Bank of Queensland, I was the Treasury accountant there. For every $1 million we lent out, 60% of it was foreign debt. Right? If that financial markets, if those capital controls hadn't been lifted, you could have only lent 40% or the $400,000 to the younger generation. Now, in the old days, that was a virtuous cycle, because that $400,000 represents the savings of the older generation. It represents the earnings of the older generation, right? So that meant that basically house prices were tied to the earnings of the old generation, so they couldn't get away. A simple example of that would be if I pay my children $5 a week to mow the lawn and I take them to a comic book shop, the most they could pay is $5. If I start suddenly borrowing printed money and lend them another $20, they can then pay $25, right? The comic book isn't worth any more, but we've just inflated it by printing money. Okay, and here's the thing: we didn't print the money here in Australia. We went and borrowed printed money. We started off with Japan. Remember Japan? Was basically, there was that what they call the I forget what was it, the kangaroo bond, I forget what it's called. But we started off with Japan in the late 80s and early 90s. They were printing money over fist, and then when the EU formed in 2000, there was another central bank, and they started printing money as well. So Australia, Paul Keating effectively outsourced its printing press, right? And we now borrow printed money to pay for our way. Now that is that's basically incredibly stupid, because it's basically meant that we took on all this debt, and in order to pay this debt off, we went and privatised our infrastructure assets to pay for a lot of debt. And the end result of that is, instead of doing what our forefathers did for us and leave us assets in our cupboard, we're leaving not assets for our children, we're leaving them debt. So the question is, how do we solve this problem? And this is very, very important. If there's one thing you take away today, this is what I want you to take away, because this signifies how People First actually has the know-how to solve our structural problems in the economy. What we want to do is, how many people in this room believe that an extra 100 parts per million of carbon dioxide has increased the temp in the atmosphere, has increased the atmosphere by 1 degree? No one? Anyone? No one does. How many people in this room believe in the economic advice, what we were taught in the 1980s, that you can't print, it's stupid to print, it's foolish to print money out of thin air?
That's true.
That's true. It's foolish to print money out of thin air. I didn't say print money out of thin air that was backed by nothing. I said print money out of thin air, didn't I?
Yeah.
Because I didn't. There's a little bit extra that goes with that, isn't there? That's right. There's two ways. You can print money. The question is whether or not you print money. The question is whether or not you back it with an asset or spend it. Because when we're talking about, everyone thinks if you print money, you're going to cause inflation, right? Yet again, that's not the full statement. If you print and spend, so you've got inflation's a relative number, right, between demand and supply, right? So if you've got inflation, demand is higher than supply, right? So if you print and spend, you increase demand, you increase inflation. That is correct, isn't it? But what instead of if you print it and instead of spending and increasing demand, you actually built more infrastructure and increased the supply of water and energy and better roads and better ports. Is that going to cause inflation? Or is that going to increase the supply of goods and services that it's going to drive down the cost of doing business and generate revenue?
Yes.
What's that, sorry? What, printing money? Well, that's because you're borrowing money. So here's the thing. If we build a dam in this country today for $1 billion and we go out and borrow that money, that means the first $1 billion in wealth we create, we have to repay offshore, don't we? Yep. But not only that, because you're paying interest on this, let's say it's 4% and it takes 25 years to actually start generating income on this infrastructure. You might, 25 years at 4% interest is another $1 billion in interest, isn't it? So we've just gone and lost the first $2 billion from a dam offshore because we haven't set up our capital balance sheet correctly, have we? Because what's the other way, apart from issuing debt, what other way is there to issue capital? I just told you before. No, not print. Well, it's expanding the volume of credit, but you can do it by issuing a bond or you can do it by issuing what? Has anyone got shares on the stock exchange? Yep. So do companies on the stock exchange issue new shares? If BHP came out on Monday morning and said we're going to issue new shares to buy a uranium mine or a coal mine or a copper mine somewhere, would the neoliberals come out and say BHP can't issue new shares out of thin air? They can, of course they do. Companies issue new shares all the time, right? And why do they do that? Raise capital, but how can they justify doing that? Because they're buying an asset. That's right. So in terms of an asset, in terms of balance sheet, so what exactly, so in terms of an asset, if I say I own a tractor and you come and audit me, you're going to look to see that I own a tractor and you're going to look to see look for an invoice that says I bought that tractor, right? If I've got debt, what am I looking for? What's the physical instrument under debt? What's it called? Not interest rate. What's the physical instrument? It's a mortgage. Yep. So if I've got equity, what's the physical instrument?
The house.
Yes.
The asset.
Not the asset. Not the loan. Title. Thank you very much. And what's Australia, by the way? It's a sovereign country. Yep. What does that mean? We own the land. We have title over the land. Well, we do. Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, here's the thing. We don't just have title over all the wealth in this country, do we? We also have title over something else, don't we? All the untapped wealth, right? Because every day, every year, I've just talked about it at the start of the day. If you're going to issue credit out of thin air, what should you secure it against? Assets that come out of thin air. Yep. And what are the assets that come out of thin air? Rain, sunlight, the soil and the resources in the soil. Yep. Okay. We have title over all that. If you mix it with what, you get wealth. Said it before. Toil. Yep. It's in the words of our national anthem. And therein lies the solution to our problem. Because what we do at the moment is, because we've got all this debt on our balance sheet, because Keating lifted capital controls and we sold all our infrastructure, we have to harness all that recurring revenue that comes out of the sky every year, and we have to pay it to ourselves as dividends instead of paying it to foreign banks as interest. Yep. And how do we do that? Well, people first has the know-how. And this is, if you're out there talking to people, this is the message I really want you to get, is that we know how to do this. We're going to issue a share just like they do on the stock exchange, and we're going to call it untapped wealth. We're going to start an infrastructure bank in Canberra, and we're going to lend to the state governments on 7 sovereign assets, okay, that they build, right? The state governments are responsible for building infrastructure, and that they are going to be dams, power stations, tunnels, railway lines, ports, airports, and telecommunications. They don't just happen to be big sovereign. The reason why they're sovereign infrastructure assets is because they are very important to the welfare. I'll take a question in a minute. To the welfare of this country, right? They are, and they should not be in private hands, because there is no elasticity of choice with big infrastructure assets, right? If I'm a sugarcane farmer in Ballina Actually, I'll give you a better example. The New South Wales government sold the Newcastle port back in 2013. 9 months later, the new owners, Macquarie Bank was one of them, jacked up stevedoring fees and port charges by 60%. Right now, how do you think if you're admittedly the big coal companies, suck that price up, but if you're a small business, so if you're on the other hand, you take, say, if you're a sugarcane farmer in Ballina, and Wilmar comes in and buys, the Singaporean company and buys your mills, your sugarcane mills, which is what they've done along the eastern coast, and they start sticking up sugarcane milling fees by 60%. Do you think the farmer can take the sugarcane up over the Story Bridge in Brisbane and up to the next sugarcane mill in Bundaberg? Of course not, right? If you're going to have for markets to work, you've got to have elasticity of choice. So we are capitalists here at People First. We believe in people who risk their own capital. So they're people that get out of bed and put their nose to the grindstone because you've got financial capital and you've got, I'm talking now liberatory capital, but you've also got human capital, right? So it's not just, and this is the big false dichotomy between, wages, labour and capital. Labour is human capital. Don't be fooled by that dichotomy. It's very important. But our solution, if we build that infrastructure bank, and then we lend to state governments, they then build the assets, those infrastructure, they can then repay that interest back to the infrastructure bank, and then that infrastructure bank can pay a dividend back to the federal government. That's really, really important. So if we drop a ball in a paddock with 20 cows, and you come back a year later and it's rained and you've got sunlight, you should have 20 calves, right? Those calves, whether it's wheat or barley you're planting or calves or more lambs or whatever, you are getting recurring revenue out of the sky every year. Because I often hear people say, oh, we're doomed, Albanese, 3 years of Albanese, we're doomed. We're not doomed because we are a very lucky country with access to 7 million square kilometres of land with an abundance of resources. All we have to do is fix up our balance sheet to put the wealth that this country gives us and make sure to channel it back to our children. Now, we want to do a little bit more than that. So we've got an infrastructure bank over here. We also want to bring back a savings bank like Commonwealth Bank because I know last time I was in, well, it was a couple of years ago now. It wasn't the last time, actually. I went down to Sale. We had a RAT banking inquiry into the closure of branches in the regions. I know in Tasmania, a town on the west coast, east coast, I think it is, Tasmania, has just lost their last branch. We want to keep branches open in the regions. We want to keep a bank that keeps serving cash because, we don't want, if this digital currency comes along, we're more forced to, basically undertake transactions only in digital currency. They will be able to coerce us into doing things. They'll be able to monitor us and coerce us. And if you want to sometimes I use my credit card because it's convenient, but I also want to use cash. I want that option. So that the government can't coerce me. So it's really, really important to have a public bank for those reasons. It's also important to have a public bank to keep the private banks honest. The best way to engage, I believe in the public practice model of, I don't believe in the PPP system whereby the government and the private sector build something together, but I do believe where you've got private banks and you have one public bank to keep the private banks honest. Likewise, I believe in private hospitals because I want private hospitals to keep public hospitals honest and provide a high level of service and elective surgery for where you can't always get that in a public hospital, right? Now, here's the thing. With that public bank, we want to bring back a national government insurance office. I know up in Queensland, we sold Suncorp in the late 90s. I suspect you had a government insurance office down here, did you? And that got privatised?
Yeah.
Correct? Yep. So 50% of insurance costs today actually go offshore. We do not reinsure ourselves here in Australia. I don't know why the federal government can't reinsure the private insurance companies as well, because if they were to do that, we could lower the cost of insurance by reinsurance makes up about 50% of the cost. So if the federal government just put a small 5 or 10% increase on that, we could bring insurance costs down by 40 or 50%, right? And that would bring more people back into the insurance pool, and then we can lower the cost of insurance. The beautiful thing about having a public bank over here and a infrastructure bank over here that makes money, we can put money back into the middle, into a bank in the middle called what? Started in 1959 by Robert Menzies, into a development bank. And what that development bank does is that will then re-lend to state governments and councils for things like sewages and what we call cost centres. right? Now, the beauty of having that free banking system is that you will take out the cost of finance interest from all levels of government. We no longer pay private banks interest to use what? To use our own currency. Go and look at that currency. That currency is backed by you, the Australian people, and your taxes. Why do we pay private banks to use your money? When I talk, one thing to do it on a housing loan, I'm talking about through the government. So you're paying twice, right? You might borrow money from a bank on your housing loan, but we now got $1 trillion in debt at 4%. That's $40 billion a year we're paying in interest to banks. Why do we do that? Because we got brainwashed in the 1980s that you can't print money out of thin air and that we shouldn't, the banks, the central government, the government should have no say in how monetary policy works. When was the last time you got to vote for the RBA governor? Yeah, exactly. Right? And that's by design because they don't want you controlling the money supply. Right? When they said in 1983 they're floating the dollar, right? That was rubbish. They don't float the dollar. The dollar is controlled by the International Bank of Settlements. And by the way, the dollar should be, we should have someone controlling it to a degree. It should be the government, not the International Bank of Settlements. But it is foolish to think that our dollar floats and that it's not being looked, kept within a certain parameters. And we know that because I don't know if you saw that footage where I asked Michelle Bullock for the minutes of the meetings between the RBA and the International Bank of Settlements. Did anyone see that? She wouldn't give it to me. And I said, why won't you give it to me? And she said, if I did, we wouldn't have a seat at the table with the International Bank of Settlements. So that's monetary policy. But the point is, our currency lads and lasses, our first generation of Australian born, knew more about monetary policy than what we did. And that's something we've got to fix because can you see how the solution is to turn interest into dividends? And as you know how it works, dividends come to us, interest goes offshore. And by the way, how much tax do those foreign banks pay on that interest paid offshore, by the way? Zero. And there's a section in the Tax Act that said foreign banks don't have to pay withholding tax on interest.
Really interesting on the super stance, make super voluntary. I really like that.
My son, he's a bit of an economist. He had a problem with it, and I tried to explain what it was about, but my explanation was like, it's like broken pig. It was like pidgin English. I couldn't explain it properly. He's like, that doesn't make any sense. I went, well, it did at the time. I said, maybe you can watch this and you can understand it.
So I think what's really interesting is it's funny how you forget things. When Super first came in, I'd forgotten it was 2%.
Yeah,
and then
started
it's
at 2%.
It's grown now
it's 12. Yeah.
Basically, what they want is to allow us to make our own decisions on that 12.5 or 12% of our income.
Yep.
If we want to put it away for our savings, do it. If you want to pay your mortgage off quickly, do it.
Yeah, and
if you want to go on a holiday,
in this market, you want to be paying a mortgage off quicker.
Yeah.
Because that interest just is a killer.
And as he said, 40% of people retiring today are retiring with a mortgage. Whereas when Super came in, it was only 10%.
Yeah.
And more people rely on the pension now than they did when Super came in. So it hasn't worked.
It hasn't worked the way they have been selling it. Yeah.
And at the end of the day, what he says is right. It's our money.
Yeah.
Why are we giving it to people who are charging us fees for what?
Yeah.
And are doing with it whatever? We don't really understand.
No, we don't know what they're doing with it. It could be doing anything. Good on you guys. See ya.
See ya.